approach. What the Venice Biennale actually did is talked about a showcase, and ironically they modelled it on the trade fair concept, which was very, very big in terms of industry back in the 19th century. So places like the Crystal Palace. Even Rodin ended up adopting that kind of entrepreneurial approach when he was presenting his work at those times. So this event, the Venice Biennale, happened fortuitously as an anniversary gift to King Umberto and Queen Margherita of Savoy as a kind of a gesture for their wedding anniversary, something that the Venice municipality put on for them. It was really interesting because, again, this aligns with this concept of the merchant class. It's quite ironic that I now live in Singapore, which is kind of like the logistics capital of the world. But going back in time, that's the role that Venice played, being on the spice route and being at that kind of junction where many cultures came together and gave them an opportunity to rethink who they were, to actually be eclectic in that architectural setting that they were presented. And in a way, it's kind of very much like the arts. It's almost a charade. It's almost a veneer. I mean, Venice is a floating island. I mean, its stability is really with what it's brought in from outside, not with what it starts off with, which is the antithesis to Australia, if we're thinking about that as another filter. You know, here we are a land mass that is so rich in resources. Places like Venice and Singapore are the opposite. They have to invest in innovation and their people to really make a difference. So the idea of the art market being part of this initial concept of setting up the Biennale is really important. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to measure their success. Number of artists, number of sales, number of countries that were coming in. And of course this has all been recorded over many, many years. And it's wonderful to look at the statistics that come from the Biennale so that we get a sense of how many people from all over Europe and nowadays with contemporary transportation opportunities all over the world will come to the Venice Biennale. When I had opportunities, I used to do the Vernissage, which is the two-day preview before the Biennale happened. Well, you know, one year there were 6,000 journalists. We were all just fighting to get in to get our stories filed before the Biennale started. And, you know, 6,000 journalists can make a hell of a mess in terms of looking at art and getting the ideas and trying to find the best pieces. And it was a little bit, I suppose, like it must have been on the gold diggings, trying to find the best place to set up camp and actually get your photographer to photograph that particular installation, and so that you had enough context to write it up and get it back to your editor. But it was an absolute sort of dynamic event, and this is exactly what the Biennale continues to do. Biennale has actually been running consistently since 1895, except during the Second World War, leading up to the Second World War, when Mussolini banned foreign artists from coming into the Biennale. And again, that's a very interesting area. So, of course, in the 1930s Biennale, you will see that it is very much about futurism and the work that Marinetti was doing. So again, it kind of shapes very much where Italy was on at that particular time. We weren't part of the Biennale then, although an Italian artist, Dante Robero, who came to Australia in 1907, went home to visit his family and went to the Biennale and said, this is a place that Australia should be. And he actually, we've got that in the archive in Sydney, the first reference of saying Australia should be represented at this place. Back in 1924, we were officially invited, but we weren't in a position to send artwork there. It was just too difficult, the logistics. But this very small document actually talks about who's represented at the Biennale, and you can sort of see there's a strong contingent that have been representing all the way through. But Australia actually comes in here in 1954 for the first time. And then we've got an ongoing presence there for a couple of years, and then we stopped and then we started again. And you'll see that there's been some interruptions in other nations as well. But those interruptions actually are just as important as the participation, because we actually start to see what's happening politically and socially, why artists aren't being represented in the Biennale. In 2011, the last Biennale that I attended, it was the largest and most inclusive Biennale, with 86 nations attending. This is very important because it's no longer saying that the contemporary arts are just for Western nations. This gives everybody a voice. And when you go and look at the work, and often there are artists who you don't know, this is one of the other great things, that you can go in there and get a fresh experience of art practice. And then if you can get some sense of the context of where these artists have come from, whether they're from, Rwanda or Zimbabwe or somewhere like that, you know about their political contexts as well. And this really does give us an insight into many more things, greater than just aesthetics and techniques. Australia, as I said, has a proud history of over 60 years, but there are some interruptions. After the 58 exhibition, there was a 20-year hiatus, and that was largely because of Robert Menzies, who was the arts minister in that particular political regime. And it's interesting that 78 is actually partly to do with the Australian Council, because the Venice Biennale only represents artists that are acknowledged by national authorities. So you can't just exhibit at the Venice Biennale because you'd like to. It's done by national invitation. We also missed 84 again, and this is largely because of our P problem, the pavilions, which I'll talk about in a moment. And some of you might have noticed in the Australia Today or The Age, there is talk of the new pavilion that Dean Corky-Marshall are designing for the 2015 Biennale. But basically from Iman Stiller's onward, we've had consistent representation. And what this does is it really gives us this wonderful view of what Australia thought about itself, what it thought about big issues. Look at the inclusion of Indigenous names. Look at the balance of, males back up here, and then we get Rosalie, and then all of a sudden we start to see gender balance coming through. We start to move away from painting into installation work, and through here, a little bit of early video with Ken Unsworth, moving through into photography, videography, sculptural pieces which were outsourced by Patricia Piccinini, and a whole range of new mediums that are being used here to represent our contemporary art. This was actually the letter. It was one of the great privileges, I suppose, about doing a PhD, and I know some of you doing PhDs here, but being able to find a project that you can just immerse yourself into. I mean, it's an indulgence, and you obviously need to have a supportive wife and supportive bosses and all of those things to do this, but being able to go through the archives in Venice and to pick out letters that were written in 1924 inviting Australia here, to pick out an ink fountain pen written letter by Sidney Nolan talking to the commissioner about would he please post his lens cap back from his camera because he left it on his desk when he was having a cup of coffee discussing the UNESCO prize. And these sorts of beautiful things that allow you to really get underneath the artwork, to actually start to feel something about what it is to be an artist, not just about the paintings and the sculptures and those things, but what it is to live the life of somebody in the art world. So this is really our first representation, and this was of course the Menzies cabinet. Menzies assumed the role of Minister for the Arts, simply because he was a great art collector. Beautiful works in his collection. But he kept rejecting the opportunities to go to Venice. We were invited many times, and people like Bernard Smith, talked about it in 1952. Why aren't we at the Venice Biennale? We are a mature, country now. We have the ability to send work there, and gradually contemporary artists raised hell and said to Menzies, look, we've got to represent ourselves. If we're a significant country in the world, we need to present. I remember showing this to Bernard one day, and he said, I've completely forgotten I wrote that, which was really interesting. Even these snapshots of Rialto, every year they've had a new banner that goes across the bridge that talks about the Biennale are great insights into that particular history. Because Australia was invited into the Biennale fairly late, we hadn't built a pavilion or a space to actually represent our work. So we shared the central pavilion, and we had room 34 in the first time. We were surrounded by many other countries that were presented in there. And eventually in '58 we were given the porch area, which was a fenced-in section through here with Ken Unsworth, John Davis, Robert Owen and then John Davis in that section there. But the first few exhibitions were actually fairly contemporary works from Australia. So Drysdale, Dobell and Sid Nolan had some work in Europe at the British Council, and we moved some of those pieces into Venice to actually get our first representation in '54. Now it's interesting because this is contemporaneous, so this is the French pavilion, and you can see that there is a sense of very modern work being presented there as well. In '56, Albert Tucker was in Europe and he presented a few works in an independent show. But then in '59, Robert Menzies decided this was a great opportunity to really show how good Australia was in the arts. And this is what we showed. Poor old Arthur Streeton had been dead for 30 years. This was exhibited when Jackson Pollock's work was in the next room. And one of the attendants said to one of the Australian commissioners who came in to see the exhibition, they said, if you like this sort of work, you'll probably like what the Poles are doing as well, because they had very traditional work that really belonged to the 19th century. Menzies, in terms of to acquiesce to the contemporary, also suggested that we could take we could take a live one with us. So he said that Arthur Boyd could go as well. And Arthur Boyd, it was interesting, was only allowed to show his landscape works, whereas at exactly that moment in 1958, he was working on his Mourning Bride and the Bride and Stockman series, which was all about racial disharmony, I suppose, in Australia. But of course, Menzies censored that out quite deliberately, so that we weren't seen to be controversial in any way. Now, what this ended up doing was created such a furore amongst contemporary artists. And of course, this is the time of the Antipodean Manifesto. All of those sorts of really edgy things were happening in Australia. Alan McCulloch just laid it on the line and said, look, why are we presenting old-fashioned work in a contemporary exhibition? Menzies said, all right, if they're not happy with what I'm sending, we just won't do it anymore. So 20 years we stopped representing ourselves in Venice. Until 78. And again, this was product of the Whitlam government setting up the Australia Council and taking out of government hands. It was still a government agency. But it was really interesting because one of my master's supervisor, a guy called Robert Owens, was actually called up and said, you know, we need 3 people to represent ourselves in Venice. The whole show is going to be about naturalism and contemporary art. Can you pack your bag and go? And he was virtually, that was the selection process. The other one was John Davis. John Davis's work has become iconic, I think, in terms of the kind of the natural fibre works. He kind of hybridised between contemporary sculpture, which was largely about plastics and acrylics at the time, and reverted back to the tracker art concept and created these wonderful installations which have become iconic artworks. This is Robert Owens' work. Robert Owen actually worked a little bit with Joseph Beuys when he was in London in the early 70s. And Ken Unsworth's work has become quite iconic too. So we're actually looking at great selections of work in 78. This is where it was exhibited in the porch. The next exhibition was in 80 with Kevin Morrison, who was arrested for being naked in the Biennale. Mike Parr's a significant Australian artist today, highly conceptual. And Tony Coling, who's just a naughty boy. I think Tony did everything to be mischievous. This is, of course, one of his great works called An Australian Native Plantation with Jackies and Jill Aboriginal gnomes out in front of the porch. He also picked up on Doug Anthony and Malcolm Fraser's yellow cake debacle, I suppose, with selling uranium to France back in '78. And he was also naughty enough to set up a vending stand where he was selling or giving away Vegemite sandwiches. This is before Men at Work did their great song. And he was also banned for selling food which wasn't sanctioned by the vendors. So we had enormous controversy in 80. Then, of course, we had Peter Booth, famous artist, and that wonderful suite of very rich paintings that Peter Booth produced in the early 80s was all shown at Venice. This was in a temporary pavilion, and in fact there was a bomb blast in Venice, and actually it blew some of the works off the wall. Now these are priceless works nowadays. I mean, these are some of the great works of Australian art. And Rosalie Gascoigne is the other one who exhibited. Rosalie started making art in her late 50s, and absolutely wonderful correspondence. I was able to go through all of her correspondence after she passed away. Martin Gascoigne, his son, was able to pull out all of the letters about how she burst an eardrum on the plane going over there, how there was a fiasco and the venues weren't right, and all of these things. But Rosalie Gascoigne, again, particularly these sorts of installations, have become absolute standouts of the art of the 1980s. 84 we didn't exhibit, there was no space for Australia. 86 we moved into the Arsenale, and Imans Tillers, who was at the height of his work, working on reproductions of contemporary artworks on these small panels, were shown. And in fact, a number of the German artists, because we also had Bachelet and Kiefer, those artists were also exhibited, and they were astounded to see that their work was being appropriated by this Australian Latvian artist at that particular time. Finally, we in 1998 stood up and said we will now purchase a pavilion, and the Hawke-Keating government found some funding, but the space in Venice was only available if they could set up this pavilion in 1 year. Phillips Cox, who was the head of the Design Council, was able to cobble together a design very quickly, and 4 weeks before the Venice Biennale started, where they were going to show the work of Arthur Boyd, they sent over a prefabricated pavilion that was designed by Cox, using a lot of the technology that had been used in the Darling Harbour project that he worked on. Unfortunately, one of the pallets disappeared. They had bad weather, and ultimately the pavilion wasn't ready for the opening of the Biennale. It didn't have any windows in it. We actually had Arthur Boyd's priceless encaustic works sitting in Venice in humidity with no windows, flapping on the wall, waiting for the opening, and then of course the works were covered in plastic and put into a storeroom where insect infestation colonised some of the encaustic paintings. Marvellous stories again. The Commissioner Grazia Gunn wrote many of these in her diary, and I was able to find all of her diaries because they had been stored at the State Library after the AETA files had been taken away from the Australia Council. There's lots of stories within stories. So poor old Arthur Boyd was criticised when he exhibited in 58, and then of course his work wasn't really even shown in 88. But eventually the building was completed, the windows were put in, the air conditioning was set up, and I think we actually made our final really big, bold statement as a nation by representing Indigenous people in the Biennale. The work of Rover Thomas was exceptional, and the other work was the work of Trevor Nichols, who was a contemporary trained artist working out of Adelaide with his Machine Time, Dream Time, spiritual figures. These works were really celebrated. It's interesting that when I was also doing some research into this, I found that in terms of the artists' fees, out of all of the Biennales, Rover and Trevor got the least. I think they got a $600 total per day, which is just appalling when we think about how we actually represent these artists who are at the height of their careers, and of course have been collected in national collections all over the world. Jenny Watson followed up in 1993. There was a one-year gap because they wanted to align the Biennale to align with 1995 to get a centenary, because we'd moved 1 year out during the Second World War. Jenny Watson's work was probably the most curatorially challenging work, because she actually really thought about museology. You can see that the works were hung outside of normal traditions, and of course the work and the sort of the plaque next to it were the works as well. So it was a very interesting work. This was called Veils and False Tales. Robert Hughes, in his inimitable style, talked about her work as being eligible for a new prize. In Venice, there is a thing called the Golden Lion, and that's the work that the best piece of work in the exhibition is given. Robert Hughes coined a new prize called the Leaden Ass, and he was going to award this to poor old Jenny, who, is still smarting about that work. Very interesting works though. And of course a very strong feminist statement. So we just had Indigenous work and then we have feminist work coming through. Bill Henson in 95, absolute showstopper, celebrated. Australia really is starting to make a mark in this exhibition. 97, Fluent, a truly curated show by Henny Perkins and Bronwyn Croft, two great Indigenous curators, created an absolute storm with the work of Emily Nawaring, whose work has become so important in terms of contemporary art. Here was this 90-year-old woman who had painted in the last 10 years of her life and captured so much of her tradition in these evocative works that really was celebrations in the Biennale. Yvonne Kulmaitri, the basket weaver from Berry, who reinvested the great Naranji tribal weaving of sedge grass and created these beautiful eel traps. And Judy Watson, who's continued to be a significant player on contemporary art, had a series of works, and a performance by Stephen Page from Mangara was also presented there. 99 was Howard Arkley, his last major exhibition before he OD'd when he got back. And again, Australia was just celebrated with this kind of retro production with these wonderful stencil-based works, which really harks back onto an old tradition. Our first real effort to look at installation video works with Lyndall Jones, Deepwater Aqua Profunda. I think perhaps one of the most poetic works that we've held in Venice. This was a small, I remember interviewing Lyndall and she said, you know, this is a plasma screen, Stephen, and it's $6,000, you know. A plasma screen back in 2001 was, God, and it was only that big sort of thing. And of course she had multiple projections. And of course this is when, you know, data projectors were still very expensive and artists were only just getting to play around with this technology. This was beautiful because it was actually lots of images, video images of water taken out of a barometer and also out of a Sydney ferry. So she was trying to bring Sydney and Venice together. And what happened is she'd have this water washing over the three screens, and eventually there would be an alignment coming up to a pier, and of course there would be these lines of the horizon moving, and all of a sudden there'd be this beautiful alignment, and you just felt, and it was just the sort of really poetic, toned down contemporary artwork. I really praised this work in a review, and a couple of people said, oh, you're far too generous, and I said, well, did you actually look at the work? Did you spend any time with it? I said, no, you just passed on. So, and I think that's the thing, that you need to immerse yourself in these works and really try and get something out of them. Piccinini's work was a huge shock over there too. People loved it. She, in terms of being an entrepreneurial artist, is a great example. I mean, doesn't produce any of this work herself, it's all the ideas and use of Sam Jinks to produce those works, but an absolute innovator in terms of the sort of work that she's done. Antithesis, I mean, this is the clever thing about the way the Australia Council has made its selections. You have this really high-end work about sort of biotech issues in Piccinini's work, and then you have this beautiful reversal to Whittler. Ricky Swallow's whittled pieces of sculpture, of fish, you know, iconic objects, creating tableaus that hark back to you know, the 19th century. I mean, just this beautiful play off these objects, and they were just singing, you know, to be photographed and to experience them in the round, and know that this had all been carved by this one young man. Beautiful stuff. The other thing that the Australia Council did at this time too was it started to have satellite exhibitions that weren't in the pavilion. So Susan Norrie had a video installation, Daniel von Sturmer had a video installation in the pavilion. Callum Morton, the architect, created a three-quarter scale of his home that his father produced for Valhalla. Then again, we move into 2009 with Sean Gladwell, who'd done beautiful work in the previous Biennale and was given the whole pavilion, playing around with his kind of Mad Max images, his Mad Maximus show, which again tried to play off that poetic and tap into the Australian zeitgeist. And a lot of people really identified with it. And again, we also started to work in these satellite shows with a really hard work by Vernon Arkia, who, I guess, inverted language and indigeneity to kind of created another version of identity in Australia, which was a very strong work. Healy and Corrillo created an installation made out of, I don't know how many thousand VHS cassettes, but the thing was that if you actually played all of these video cassettes, it would add up to the duration of the average person in the world's life. And I thought it was a really interesting way of tapping into something that we all identified with and then recasting it in a new sense. And Kenyon Atani's beautiful sugar sculptures, which were actually products of his work here at JCU or when he was working at Owens. So these are pieces from the Great Barrier Reef, and all made of sugar, which will fabricate beautiful works again. But you'll notice too that we're now starting to use our immigrant artists who are representing Australia, because we start to identify that Australia is a land of many people. And the most recent one, 2011's Hania Manius's work, incredibly conceptual work. A lot of people really struggle with it because it's all about this sense of artifice and the kind of inversion of what you think you're seeing and what you're really seeing. For instance, this anvil is made of styrene foam, but it's actually not made of styrene foam. It's actually cast in bronze and repainted to look like styrene foam. So it kind of is this play on things. So you've got this stuff that looks like it's come out of a dump master, old chipboard tables with chrome legs, all cast out of bronze and then faked to look like what it was originally. So again, you sort of, I mean, you come up to it and think, well, why would you do it? You know, so you kind of pushes you into another way of looking at things. And people really struggle with it. Now, I was just going to quickly say that Singapore also has a history at the Venice Biennale, but it's only got a 10-year history. And because Singapore is coming up to celebrate its 50th anniversary in 2015, they're not exhibiting this year, which is a great tragedy. And a lot of contemporary artists in Singapore are very concerned with the government. But in Singapore, the government is very strong and controls things. They invest a lot of money in the arts, but not in this particular contemporary area. But we get some wonderful sense of how playful the Singaporeans. The No Merlion is a great concept work for 2015. If you've ever been to Singapore, our iconic statue is the Merlion, because of course the lion is the symbol for Singapore, and the fish, because of course Singapore is a fishing village. And the idea was to take this 80-ton sculpture that is iconic in Singapore and transpose it into Venice for the duration. But of course it was never going to happen, but it was to think about why Singapore would do something like that. So it's very nice contemporary work. These works by Vincent Guyot, fabulous pieces that we probably have seen in many art journals. The Ming Wong work was all about the history of cinema in Singapore. This was a beautiful exhibition that really tapped into that. And of course, 2011, the Hong Zhu Nyun, the Cloud of Unknowing. For those of you who actually got to Venice and were in this space where they pumped fog into the room, and then you watched these very tall buildings, these HDB towers where most Singaporeans live, and it created this kind of other world which represented it. And we were all, I think, so disappointed that we couldn't see Singapore work in this Biennale. So ultimately what I'm suggesting is that yes, we can look at all of this art as art. And I could give you an art history lecture about where it all fits in. We could talk about technique and, you know, how drawing has gone to hell in a handbasket and artists can't draw and there's no technique, and why does Patricia Piccinini not make her own work? And we could have all of those discussions. But we could also start to look at it as a way of seeing who we are as Australians, what our political regimes are telling us about how they see us, who they will let go to Singapore, who they won't let go to Singapore, who actually gets into the Biennale, who gets into the shortlist of the Biennale. It gives us all of these types of ways of seeing things. And as I've gone around so many biennales, I get a sense of how other nations are looking at their work, whether there's a sense of insecurity, whether there's a sense of opulence. I know that looking at the American pavilion is often a great sort of touchstone to sort of see how things are going. You know, at the height of the GFC, they had an inverted tank, an army tank, upside down, where they had somebody running on a treadmill that drove the tracks on this tank. We saw what a banal kind of exhibition, just talk at the height of a kind of a global depression that's about to hit. So it does give us this other filter. We've got so many statistics now about using a kind of art metrics to measure how successful economies are going, you know, the art index. And this is a fascinating other side of economics. The other thing is to think about art as the composite indicator. It does allow us to put a number of quite disparate pieces of data together to actually look at things from a new perspective. And I do think there's a lot of room for theorists in the arts to actually to recast where the arts actually fit in terms of the future. As I said, I think Australia is now stepping up to the mark. We have cemented our place by having a pavilion, which was a temporary pavilion, but now we're actually going to have our own pavilion. It's going to be the white cube, which is the traditional viewing space in modernity, inside the black exterior cube. So there's a real play on words that's going to be part of Denton Court and Marshall's work, which I think will be very exciting to see. And apparently they've got the $6 million largely through philanthropy, which now also aligns us with much of the rest of the world, that it's not just functional budgeting system, but actually engages with real people, people who have a love of the arts, people who have a love of the sciences, people who have a love of the economy, and people are now starting to see the arts as being, you know, an integrated part of who we are, not as a kind of extraneous thing that elite people engaged with. So for 2013, Simran Gill is actually going to be representing Australia. And the great thing is that Simran was actually born in Singapore, so I sort of feel a bit of Singapore is going to be presented there. Simran's got a great tradition of work. She's exhibited in many international exhibitions, including Documenta, and I think that she'll certainly create a great show there in Venice this year. I suppose this just brings me back to the start of why I was so interested in art as a kid. It gives us a different lens. I've always perhaps felt a little bit on the margins, not seeing things the way everybody else does. But I guess what it's about is seeing something and then articulating it. Peter and myself were having a quiet glass of wine over dinner a week or two ago, and we were saying how important it is for artists to stop making art and to actually start talking about it, and even better still, writing about it. Because there is a sense of cognitive process that actually happens when you can articulate what it is that you're doing. When you look back on a body of work, when you put up a show and you think, yeah, there's 12 months or there's 18 months of work that you actually can see in context. I think about Jenny Hock's work. I saw her show a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, yeah, this is a great opportunity to actually sit back and look at, you know, a whole lot of images about Townsville and, outside of Townsville, and about painting and about a whole lot of those sorts of things. The paintings do great works, and people can buy the paintings, they can look at the paintings and stuff, but what is it that we think? And, I know that Jenny's, interested in research. One of the things that I think artists can do is find a way of articulating what it is that they're contributing to our future. The whole notion of creating new knowledge, and that new knowledge is of course always within us. I mean, we take the time, we spend the time in the studio, we put the work together, but often it can't go any further than just to be purchased by somebody and to have that conversation. So I would really urge those of you that feel up to it to actually start to articulate and to also do that collaboratively with your friends, you know, to actually put down some words, write a page about somebody else's show, get it into a journal. I mean, Jeanette actually, you know, with the art days that we used to have, you know, had an opportunity where people could put out those things. I know you can blog it, you can do all sorts of things, but
send it to art days.
Send it to art days. You know, these are the sorts of things that will get us noticed. I mean, the thing is that I think that we make things matter by presenting them and then articulating the stories that relate to them. We wouldn't have any idea about what was happening in the Renaissance unless Vasari wrote about it. You know, he was able to capture those stories. And that gives us that other window, that view from the outside in or the inside out. So all I can say is I think that there's great opportunities to use contemporary art as a way of repositioning our future, and not just in the arts, across the economy, across the political spectrum, because it does matter, and we can actually see how much we've grown as a nation by looking back at this work. So that was really the kind of final statement that I made in my thesis, is that when I started off, I was writing a history of the Venice Biennale. At the end of the process, I actually discovered something very new, that we had a snapshot, a window into a 60-year history of Australia, not just the arts, but a 60-year window into Australia. And as I said, I think that's when you discover something like that, it's a great moment. It's that kind of eureka moment. And I think that's probably where we should probably leave it. So you might think about that. Jim.
I'm just curious, the Biennale is obviously the biennial event in terms of art, but in terms of Venice and the concept of driving all those other forms of art, theatre, cinema, music, dance, you don't see that in Australia. Do you think there's an opportunity for a community to take something like that up and fashion possibly a festival every couple of years around that whole concept?
Yeah, look, I think that in a way Venice becomes the most pervasive arts festival city in the world. Adelaide's also done it. I think Adelaide has that grand tradition too. But as I said at the start, it's a bit like Singapore. Venice has nothing. I mean, it's a floating city. It's got absolutely nothing except the fact that it's been eclectic and it's sucked in the good from the people that are sailing by. And eventually what they were able to do is say, well, let's celebrate things that are really important, such as contemporary art, or contemporary film, you know, with the great festival at the Lido, or whether it's the Architecture Biennale and those things. And what they've got is the opportunity to draw people in to such a great venue city. We probably need to recognise the places where we do it, because I think the last decade and a half in Australia, everybody's wanted to get festival status. And certainly the Australia Council encouraged that, but maybe not every country town, every country city needs to have an art festival which is a mirror of the other art festival. You know, we do one like Cairns does one like Mildura does one like you know, somebody else. I mean, we have to find what's distinct about us. Things like Strata Ephemera, I think, was a great example of us really tapping into something. The Chamber Festival is a brilliant example. Yeah, you know, Charters, Towers, Country and Music, I mean, that's a great festival. You know, I think what we've got to do is work out what it is that we do really, really well, and that's our point of difference. And then market like hell and get the whole community behind it so that we've got champions. Because that's really how the Venice Biennale started. That's how Casal Documenta started. You know, you need one person who's really, really passionate and able to galvanise a community.